All right, welcome to Halitics. I'm Hal Ginsberg, and not seeing my face. There we go. Well, I'm still not seeing me. That's because I had to change the scenes. Hal Ginsberg here on Halitics. It is Tuesday. It is not an Arlen Tuesday. I may have said it was going to be an Arlen Tuesday. Not an Arlen Tuesday today because an Arlen Tuesday. I may have said it was going to be an Arlen Tuesday. Not an Arlen Tuesday today because I believe Arlen is in transition from one side of the country to the other. No, he's not changing his sex. He's just moving from west to east, as he is wont to do in the spring. Kind of a different migration, usually, I guess, in the spring. What's it? Summer now, isn't it? It's going to be summer if it isn't yet. Just about summer. Anyway, migration usually is south to north in the spring and north to south in the summer, at least if you're in the northern or fall, at least if you're in the northern hemisphere. So that's not what Arlen's doing. Arlen is simply moving back east for the summer, where he has a lovely, I understand, I haven't been there, but I assume it's lovely, a lovely home in Vermont, which itself is quite lovely. Today's topic is going to be kind of a question, and I invited Peter B. Collins, old friend of Halitics, to join me, and I just got a response from him. He'll be on tomorrow, so we'll continue the conversation then. But I'm going to definitely focus on it. I'm really psyched to have Peter be on. Also, haven't spoken to him in quite a long time. The question for today and for tomorrow is, should you cancel if you are a subscriber to the New York Times? Should you cancel it? And I'm really upset about two terrible, and I use the word appalling in my thumbnail, two appalling editorials, not op-eds, not from some, piece of garbage like a David French or I don't know there's another right-winger on there. They're all bad. There's not one, and this is a huge problem with the paper. There's not one good op-ed writer. There's not one consistently progressive voice. No one even close on that page. Sometimes Nick Kristof has a good article. Same with Tom Edsall. I thought Bob Herbert was the last pretty decent columnist in the paper, and he's been gone for years now. I think maybe almost 10 years. I'm not sure. I'd have to look that up, but quite a long time. So there's no good opinion writers. The op-ed, the opinion page itself, the editorials are terrible. They made awful decisions when it comes to their the paper's actual opinions. So should you cancel? That's the question. I honestly don't have a good answer. That's why I wanted Peter B., somebody I respect, somebody who's bright, who's in this space, who understands what's going on. And so he'll be on tomorrow to discuss, some of the same issues we're going to go over today, but I'll really focus on his opinion rather than mine. And because of the way I do my program, because I'm such a contentious cuss, I'm sure I'll argue with him when he says exactly the same things I'm going to say today. Before we get to the Times, and I just will say one last point. I hope you'll call in 240-242-5646. Just one other point, though, I want to make about this. I'm very mixed. Honestly, I asked, should you cancel the New York Times? But I'm not going to cancel it. I mean, there's a lot of super valuable information in there. They do report the news, and they report more news, I think more national, more international news than anyone else. The Washington Post is pretty good in that regard, but they're not as comprehensive by any means. So I asked the question, should you cancel NYT? And yet, to be honest, I'm not going to. I didn't cancel the Post either when they didn't endorse either of the two terrible candidates for president. I had no issue. Why should you? I mean, neither one deserved their endorsement, so it was good. So they shouldn't have endorsed. What the Post should have done is endorsed Jill Stein for president, but of course they would never do that. I mean, they would have endorsed both Harris and Trump. I think if it was Jill Stein versus Trump, they might have endorsed Trump. I could see that. I really could. I could see them endorsing Trump over Harris. I mean, over certainly, well, they didn't endorse either Trump or Harris. I could see them endorsing Trump over Stein. The situation in Gaza, which you wouldn't know from reading the New York Times, although they did a good story. I mean, it was a horrible story, but they did tell us, and I do know that, the Israeli military targets children, it shoots them in the head, because there was an article in the New York Times Magazine about that. So they get credit for that. Death toll across Gaza Strip, that was a year ago, right? Death toll across Gaza Strip surges past almost 55,500. And that's from this morning. Majority of the dead are women and children, completely putting the lie to Israel's Hasbara that, oh no, we're killing Hamas militants. How many more people are you going to kill? You know, I mean, how many more do you have to take out? And they haven't. They have, apparently, as far as we know, for every, you know, remember Chuck Schumer made the point, oh, well, for every working collar, blue collar voter we lose in Pittsburgh or outside of Pittsburgh, we can get 3 more suburban country club voters in suburban Pittsburgh, and we can replicate that and on and on and on. And didn't work out so well for you, Chuck. And I think that's kind of the Israeli strategy. Well, we'll just keep killing Palestinians, but the problem is they replicate, you know, because you kill people, then their relatives, their children, their parents, they're really angry. They don't like it. They begin to hate. I remember I got into it with a relative one time. We were talking about this, and they said to me, well, it's not good to hate. You shouldn't hate. And I said, well, maybe you shouldn't hate, but you will hate if someone kills your relatives. If they kill your children, you're going to hate them. And their response again, because I was justifying why there is, you know, the arguments, well, those Palestinians really hate Israel. They really hate the Jews. And I'm like, well, they do hate people who kill them. People hate people who kill them, who kill their family members, who destroy their villages. And the response was, well, I don't think it's okay to hate. And I'm like, well, then I don't understand. I mean, do you not get my point? And it was very frustrating because there's simply an unwillingness among Zionists and even Zionist adjacent people. When I say Zionist adjacent, they may be people who haven't thought a lot about Israel. They're probably Jewish. They're liberal politically, but they have this warm spot in their heart for Israel, and they just can't let it go. And I would like say, you know, if I wanted to be obnoxious about it, I don't get that. Isn't the evidence clear? Can't you see how bad Israel is? What more do you need to renounce this evil state? What more? But I could say that, and it's true. But on the other hand, I understand the Zionist adjacent person because I was one. Because for many years, I thought, yes, we need Israel because of the, you know, Jews are victims. We're victims. We need our own country where we will always be safe, right? And we can do whatever we want because we're only trying to protect ourselves. You know, that was my attitude. So I get the Zionist adjacent, but I'm not there now. And I think it's time to put that away. 61 Palestinians killed over the past 24 hours, including 6 bodies recovered from under debris. So I think that means, I'm not sure, 55 killed in the past, confirmed dead in the past 24 hours by Israeli action, and maybe 6 who had been killed previously but were unidentified. I'm not really clear on that, and it doesn't honestly ultimately matter very much. We do know, based on what we're hearing from Wafa News Agency, a lot of times I go to Anadolu Agency here, Wafa News providing us with information about the latest Israeli massacres in the ongoing, but the latest specific killings there in Gaza. We have 55,493 already reported. 55 people went with Monday, plus 6 more bodies, and you have over close to 5,200 Gazans killed by Trump and Netanyahu just in the past few months, and that's likely over 2,000 kids. So that's what we're doing. That's what our country is responsible for. That is what we're guilty of, and I can't think of anything more horrific. You know, I was out yesterday. I don't have the video. Oh, shoot. I was out yesterday actually protesting one of my county council members who's one of the most progressive. And she voted along with every other Montgomery County. This is supposed to be a progressive, I guess, county, right? Very progressive. She voted along with every other county council member to fund the Maryland Israeli Development Center. They work with Israel. They approach and they appeal to and they ask companies that are Israeli to do business in Maryland, have all open offices in Maryland to solicit. They solicit and lobby Congress from Maryland, right? We're really close to the capital. And some of those companies work closely with, have contracts with the military. They're part and parcel of the genocide. And this is what my county is spending our tax money on. It's horrific. It's monstrous. It's wrong. So we went to protest at the fundraiser of one of those county council members. She is otherwise progressive. She's otherwise pretty good, pretty good. But on this issue, like so many others, she cannot draw. She just will not renounce AIPAC. It's too scary for them. There's too much money. And she knows it's wrong. This is a council member who has shamed me because I challenged some aspects of the trans agenda, including, treating trans kids at, with hormones and et cetera when they're adolescents or pre-adolescents. Yeah, I had an issue with that. No denying. And also because I don't support trans athletes in girls' sports. So, she shamed me for that. They didn't like, this council member didn't like what I had to say about this. And I don't want to say shame. That's too strong. But took me to, disagreed with me. There was a real, not a meeting of the minds. And that's fine. We can disagree. But if you're going to say that the identity stuff matters, if that's what we're really going to focus on, then how about the lives? The 55,000 plus lives now that Israel's taking, doesn't that matter? Shouldn't we be focused on that more than anything else? I kind of think so. I'm kind of like, yeah, that's what really, really matters. It was at this event. We had some Palestinian flags there. People were honking. We were just simply trying to draw attention to the council members' record, all of the council members, that they are supporting Israel. They've taken sides with the genocider, and it's outrageous. All right, 240-242-5646. The question for you, the main issue, which we'll get to now, is should you cancel the New York Times based on their absolutely appalling editorials over the past few days? One insisting that there's this massive increase in anti-Semitism and we all have to be all the Jews need to be very, very afraid. Somehow I'm not afraid. You know what I'm afraid? I'm not afraid. If I were living in Gaza, I would be afraid. I'm not afraid right now. I think Jews are much more likely to be the victimizers than the victims. And the failure of, especially New York elites, but the entire political establishment, its failure to acknowledge this is incredibly upsetting. But as bad as that editorial was, and we'll get to it, what's even worse is this, their discussion of, it's hard to call it an endorsement because they don't come right out and say vote for. Well, they do. They don't quite come right out and say vote for the corrupt serial sexual harasser, Andrew Cuomo. They don't quite come out and say it, but they all but do. And then so the question is, what do we do? Because what's so wrong with this? There's so many things wrong. The biggest problem I have with it is that a lot of people will see this op-ed and it'll raise doubts in their mind about whether they should vote for Zoran Mamdani. What it won't do for many people it won't cause them to say, the New York Times has really lost its way. And the New York Times is just consistently on the wrong side of history. The New York Times represents the billionaire class in New York. It is clearly on the side of the investment bankers and the corporate lawyers. It is not on the side of working people. The New York Times is a dishonest, progressive newspaper. And I have to take everything it says, at least everything that's not reported, as fact. And even then, I have to be careful. I have to be very, very skeptical of the New York Times. That's the right response to this editorial. The right response is the New York Times is failing us. The New York Times is a huge problem. But sadly, far too many people, even if they're a little bit, maybe the Times is going overboard, maybe it's too far to the right, maybe it's not quite the lefty liberal newspaper of my dreams. Even so, they make good points. They know what's going on the ground. They're obviously super smart. They went to, they all went to Ivy League colleges, which is a major problem, by the way. That's a big problem in the newspaper. It used to be 100 years ago, 75 years ago even, newspaper reporters were often high school grads, or even not even. They might start working, as copy boys or girls, because there are female reporters too, all the way back. You can find their bylines in newspapers that had bylines back then. People like Nellie Bly, during, I believe, the First World War, was a well-known woman reporter. So the reporters often started as adolescents working in newsrooms and worked their way up. They were people who showed a certain flair for news gathering and writing. So they came of the people. They came from the neighborhoods. Now you've got your journalism degree from Columbia, or your journalism degree from Northwestern. You've got your journalism degree from Georgetown. Wherever it is, you're not of the people. Even if you at one time were, you've been polished and burnished so that your rough edges have largely been washed away. And you're kind of an aspiring member of the elites. That's today's reporter. They're not on the working people side, and they're a different kind of working person. And worse, much worse, are the editors, the ones responsible for this crap. So, according to the Times, a certain version of progressive city management has failed. And it emerged in the latter stages of Obama's presidency, when some Democrats decided that he had been too cautious and adopted a bolder liberalism. No, it's not a question of being too cautious. The problem with Obama is that he advanced policies that were pro-billionaire. It wasn't cautiousness. He went out of his way to support billionaires, whether it was opening up areas of the Arctic to gas and oil exploration, whether it was the worst things, the free trade deals, the massive increase in the security state, the great deporter. These were things that Obama did. That's not cautious. That's corporatist. That was the problem with Obama. So, no, they're already getting it very, very wrong. Progressivism hasn't failed New York. It hasn't been tried. At the municipal level, this liberalism was skeptical of it, if not hostile to law enforcement. Yeah, there are some issues there. I agree. There was hostility to law enforcement. Law enforcement, to a large degree, is now basically working to protect the billionaire class. Poor, struggling working people aren't protected, not nearly enough on subways and other parts of the city. And that should have changed. That's something that I think is a somewhat fair criticism of some liberals. Then they argue that schools need more money and less evaluation. Well, that's absolutely true. And Greedy landlords for high rents, yeah, that's part of it. Certainly private equity taking over is part of it. The real problem with high rents, again, is that just massive skewing of tiny number of billionaires and everyone else struggling. In New York, the housing is all now targeted towards the upper end because that's where the profits are. The New York Times should recognize this. The New York Times should be calling for much more equitable wealth and income distribution, but of course it doesn't do that. Of course it doesn't, because that's not what its advertisers want. That's not what its largely very affluent readership wants. But the idea that there was some sort of progressive city management that failed is utterly absurd. And then they go into a discussion of Bill de Blasio's mayoralty, which, by the way, it wasn't that bad. You know, there's a lot of criticism of him. He was mayor during COVID. The city weathered that crisis. I don't think he was a great mayor, but under, he was facing a lot of challenges. The idea that he was somehow worse than Bloomberg, who oversaw massive wealth and income transfer up, and is a big reason the city is unaffordable, is absurd. Stuff like he did not take disorder seriously enough. I don't know what they're talking about. The real problem, one of the big problems, was that there was no support for Occupy, and I would agree with that. But Occupy was before de Blasio. That was Bloomberg. So, yeah, I mean, there just simply hasn't been anyone who's taken the reins of the mayor's office and said, we have got to make life better for poor, struggling, and working people. De Blasio did to a degree, not nearly enough. That was his failure. He wasn't bold enough. He wasn't aggressive enough. His main legacy is to have contributed to the city's decline. No, there's a lot of factors. New York has got a lot of problems. Rampant real estate development, giant towers that ruin the city skyline. That's a big problem. The issues with the trash buildup was a problem, no question. That was partly because of COVID and other factors. No, I'm not going to put it on de Blasio. This is the entire neoliberal movement in our country that has starved cities, that is, except for the billionaire class within them, starved the needy. That's certainly not on de Blasio, but it suits the Times agenda. Then they compare these progressives, the allegedly progressive de Blasio, with what they would call better mayors, people like Bloomberg, who again oversaw massive wealth and income redistribution upwards to the really serious detriment of the city. Then they bring up Houston mayors, and Houston supposedly has had this great success in combating homelessness. Now, as I understand it, that's a lot of smoke and mirrors. What Houston has done is they push homeless people outside the city limits, and then they say, voila, we have less homeless. That's their basic way of dealing with homelessness. If the idea is somehow this is the abundance agenda, we're going to allow for more construction, and therefore we'll have more housing, that's absurd. There's no zoning laws in Houston. Houston is an example of anti-zoning run amok. Everywhere you go, you just see more malls, more pop-ups, more apartments. There's no order. There's no structure to it. Houston also has a very serious crime problem. So for them to claim that Houston is some example of smart dealing with homelessness is ridiculous. Then they also bring in Rahm Emanuel. Well, there were problems with the police, and they were killing people, and there was dark sites that the Chicago PD operated. But hey, test scores went up in Chicago. Graduation rates went up in Chicago. And it's unclear how true that is. There's some evidence that Emanuel's mayoralty did see schools get a little better in some ways. And the main reason is he increased the budgets. I mean, there were just more teachers for the kids. But there's an enormous caveat. He closed a lot of schools. Kids were pushed out of the schools. So, yes, there was, in the end, a higher percentage of Chicago public school graduates during Emanuel's term who attended college, but there were fewer graduates. So to that degree, you have to take the higher rate of college matriculation. You have to take it with a grain of salt because, yes, there were a higher percentage of grads, but there were fewer grads. There are so many problems that these school systems confront, that they face. It's often hard to take one factor, one number, one metric, and say, well, this shows improvement or this shows decline. There's real problems New York City has. The biggest problem New York City has is massive wealth and income inequality. That is what is driving the pathologies there. The city is run by billionaires. The city is therefore corrupt because billionaires are can very easily corrupt, relatively, underpaid, certainly compared to them, civil servants. The ability to afford living in the city is just out of reach, which the Times completely ignores in this op-ed, in this editorial. Mamdani's trying to address that. Mamdani would be part of the solution. It's also ironic because the Times complains and complains about how the city has got all these issues, all these problems. Guess what? Andrew Cuomo was governor of the state during that period of time. And his actions also made things worse for New York City. And yet, the Times is ultimately calling for Mamdani to be left off the ballot and for Cuomo to be on the ballot. And they do it in such a dishonest and disingenuous way. So let's go through this some more. Mamdani, because now they're going to go after him. They're saying, yeah, we've got all these problems, but Mamdani's the wrong person to fix it. Should you cancel your newspaper? This is the question I have. Should you cancel your New York Times? Because this is such a disingenuous, such a clearly pro-billionaire, pro-advertiser, anti-New Yorker editorial. They attack him for being a democratic socialist who ignores unavoidable trade-offs in governance. In other words, he doesn't simply go along with a neoliberal agenda. He favors rent freezes that could restrict housing supply. So I've said this before. I have issues with rent freezes. I don't think that's the best way to address housing shortages and affordable housing crisis, right? An affordable housing crisis. I don't think it's the best way. I think you have to have some kind of rent control for sure, but a freeze is problematic in certain ways. That said, the rents in New York are just completely out of whack. I mean, I talked about this before, $6,000 a month for a two-bedroom. For a two-bedroom, $6,000. That's $72,000 before taxes. No, after taxes, right? $72,000 after taxes. You have to be making over $150,000 just to pay that, and still have what, $40,000 left over? If you make $150,000 in New York, your take home's around $100,000, right? Somewhere in that range, maybe $110,000. You're paying $72,000 in rent. The rent is just completely unaffordable for so many New Yorkers. If you even have rent stabilization, it's still going to go up. So you're facing an absolute emergency. And Mamdani has made the point that we need to freeze rents because people just simply cannot afford to live here. But That's not my only answer. Yes, the city has to get involved in the construction of housing. Yes, we have to incentivize affordable housing, middle-class housing. Yes, we have to convert, places that are dilapidated, that are uninhabitable. We have to make them available. That is what he's talking about. He's not just saying rent freeze, end of story. So that's just false, what the New York Times is saying. Of course he gets the trade-off. He's saying, yeah, a rent freeze is an issue. I understand that it might disincentivize more construction. That's why we have to do other things. So wrong, lie. Make it harder for younger New Yorkers and new arrivals to afford housing. They can't afford it now. Then they go on, he wants the government to operate grocery stores as if customer service and retail sales were strengths of the public sector. Such a disingenuous, such a snide little aside, right? I live in Montgomery County. We have county-operated liquor stores. And you know what? They do a great job. They're fine. There's beer, there's wine, there's alcohol. There's all the same products as I can get in privately owned and operated stores. Now, that said, I actually think the model is better where you do incentivize lots of competition, lots of businesses competing against each other. And that's how you keep prices down. And then you provide subsidies to the consumers who need it. That's how I would, in my perfect world, address the unaffordability of groceries. But I get 100% where Mamdani's coming from. Mamdani's saying, hey, there's an oligarchy of grocery stores, and they face very high expenses. Right now, the city is giving them money directly. It's not that it's giving consumers money, it's giving the grocery stores money, because even they are having trouble operating in New York City. There's so many expenses in Manhattan. And yes, they can charge ridiculously high prices. But unless you're a high-end, Mamdani was asked this by Pod Save America, right? Another neo-lib outlet of the Obama boys. He was asked, well, you're saying that the government should compete with Zabar's? And he sort of chuckled. He's like, well, no, I'm saying that people in food deserts like Harlem and worse, like the Bronx, certain areas in Brooklyn, where there's no grocery store within anywhere near proximity to many, many New Yorkers, that there should be city-operated groceries there, where the private sector isn't going. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying in neighborhoods where there are grocery stores, but they're super expensive, yes, we should have an ability of the neighbor, of the residents, to buy fruits, vegetables, fresh meats at low, at warehouse prices. I can't understand for the life of me why you would be opposed to this unless you just are caping for the grocery store industry, which lines your pocket, which I guess is exactly what's happening here with the New York Times. So should you cancel? I mean, that's really the question I want to know. And I don't have an answer, but I really want to, Peter B. and I will definitely hash this out. But that's really the question. Should you? Because the Times, this is just crap. This is just garbage. They lie about Mamdani. We'll get into that in just a moment. But does that mean you just should simply cancel your subscription? The thing is, where do you get your news? No one else is as comprehensive as this paper when it comes to giving you information. So, I mean, I grudgingly would personally, I need information to do this program. This is part of what I do. But I think as human beings, right, we want to know what's happening in the world around us. The problem is this paper gives you such a skewed vision. And there's no consequences for this horrible editorial. And there are people who will read this and they're going to start to think, well, maybe the Times has a point. Elections are choices. I don't think Mamdani is perfect. He's so much better than Cuomo. He's so much better than the alternative. How could anyone even question that? There's an argument. Well, just because someone has a different opinion than you doesn't mean they're wrong. Of course. Sometimes we don't always share the same opinions, and some people, may be right when I'm wrong, and I totally get that. This isn't one of those times. This is a city where the elites, the billionaires, have everything. It's a playground for them. The last thing we want is another corrupt, low tax for the rich, another, somebody who views the office as an opportunity for them to collect graft, basically. And that's who Andrew Cuomo is. An opportunity to harass women. So they go on. Mamdani would bring less relevant experience than perhaps any mayor in New York history. I have no idea if there's any. I don't think John Lindsay was very experienced when he became mayor. May be wrong about that. Than perhaps any mayor. Well, he's been a state senator, a state legislator later for several terms. So he does have experience in government. That's just a false statement. Cuomo's run a government. He's run a state, and he did a terrible job of it. As a state legislator, he struggled to execute his own agenda. That's actually false, and we'll get into that. The New York Times example is a terrible example. It's dishonest. And what they're saying here contradicts their own reporting. Given an opportunity to expand a pilot program offering free bus rides, one of his signature issues, he instead engaged in a performative protest that doomed the policy. Okay, that's, by all accounts, false. Although it is true, New York Magazine did report something like that. But if you read the New York Magazine article and you read the New York Times article on this, it's clear they were trying desperately to attack Mamdani, not be honest. And the protest wasn't performative at all. He seems to lack political savvy and instinct for compromise that made Bernie, his fellow Democratic Socialist, an effective legislator. Okay, that's a laugh riot because the New York Times never missed an opportunity to slam Bernie, especially Paul Krugman, always attacking Bernie, every opportunity, but the editorial page too. I mean, look at this paper. Look at who they endorse. They endorse Hillary over Bernie. I mean, what a complete abrogation of their responsibility to do that. They endorsed, and this was a point that Corey Robin made, which I thought was a really good one. Don't worry about this endorsement. The problem is I'm in my little echo chamber where people read the New York Times. My neighbors read the New York Times, and I'm not even in New York. So in my world, the New York Times has a lot of influence. And the influence it wields here are people who are already a little skeptical. I don't really like a Democratic Socialist. I'm doing well. I have lots of money. I live well. Why should I don't want to support a Democratic Socialist. They'll raise my taxes. So there's already that fear, that sense. And then the New York Times just gives you the ability or it gives you that shield to say, well, look, the New York Times doesn't like him, so I guess I'm right. Rather than the New York Times saying, hey, wait a second. New York has terrible, terrible problems. We've tried a certain style of governing for years and years with a sort of a centrist, pro-Wall Street, pro-corporate bent. We've got to go in a different direction. It's led to a completely because that's the spin that this should be. Not, oh, well, de Blasio governed the city in a certain way, and look at all the problems we have, and now Mamdani wants to do the same thing. No, the right spin is the city has basically, the Gracie Mansion has basically turned the keys to the city over to the billionaires. People like Michael Bloomberg ran the city in ways that were incredibly harmful to everyone, but they're the people they, had dinner with at the 21 Club, if it's still around. So we need to go in a different direction. We need to center poor, struggling, and working people, middle-class people. And that's what Mamdani is calling for. That's the obvious editorial to write. Instead, they are scrambling, desperate to attack him. And then they're like, oh yeah, well, Bernie's been effective after you've slammed Bernie, trashed Bernie every opportunity, endorsed Amy Klobuchar and Elizabeth Warren for president in 2020 rather than Bernie, who was clearly the best choice by a mile. And Corey Robb makes the point, well, yeah, don't worry about the New York Times endorsement. Those two got a combined 9% of the vote in New York. Okay, still, it's not good. It's not good. So they say, let's get into that. We'll get into the pilot program. But before we do, let me see. So here's what New York Magazine, because remember they cited, the New York Times cites New York Magazine for the proposition that Mamdani killed a pilot program, that he was his signature issue. He's so, unwilling to work, so uncompromising. He killed a signature program because for some performative gesture. Oh, you can't vote for him. That's the worst they could come up with, right? Not harassing women, not covering up deaths in nursing homes, not disbanding an anti-corruption commission because they were, investigating him. No, he didn't do any of those things, but he killed a signature program. So let's see what New York Magazine, because that's who they cite. In 2023, Mamdani helped launch a one-year free bus pilot project across all 5 boroughs. Now, I thought he had no experience. I thought he wasn't a good legislator. I thought he couldn't compromise like Bernie. And yet, according to the New York Magazine here, he helped launch this one-year free bus pilot across all the boroughs, which, by the way, I'm too skeptical. But I accept this. Yes, you need free transit. Transit's expensive in New York City. It's going up and up. Definitely. Let's try something different. At least let's try it. And it worked. It worked out. Mamdani says it's a resounding success. Maybe he's kind of full, right? He's trying to make himself look good. Well, it's my program. And look, it's a big success. Kind of like Rahm Emanuel say, hey, I closed 50 Chicago public schools, but graduations went up for those who weren't kicked out of the system or weren't flunked out of the system. According to New York Magazine, not according to Mamdani, because you can see the quotes are around a resounding success. That's what Mamdani said. It was a resounding success. According to New York Magazine, ridership rose and assaults on drivers dropped. Some of those assaults were because people didn't want to pay their fare, right? Because you have to pay the driver. The driver's like, you got to pay your fare. And then people are getting pissed off. Now, do I think they should assault drivers? Absolutely not. But if you're going to make the buses more safe by saying, just come on the bus, that's good. That's good, right? And I'll tell you one thing about making bus rides free. This is not some sort of regressive. This is very progressive. The people who take buses in New York are not the big shots. They're not the big bugs. And to the extent that they do, it's nothing to them. But for the people who work at the transit authority, for people who work in restaurants, servers, that's an expense that now they no longer have to pay, or they no longer had to pay that year. It was a resounding success. But the program wasn't renewed. Oh, well, this is where we see Mamdani's performative gesture. Why wasn't renewed? Some legislators allege because Mamdani refused to support a housing measure he opposed. Wow. That's the performative gesture. He didn't support this housing measure. We'll get into that in a moment. But guess what? The people who say, this is the New York Times is saying, well, it was performative gesture killed his signature program. What the New York Magazine actually reported is the program was renewed because, according to some legislators' allegations, not proof, we don't have anything in the record, they say because Mamdani didn't support a housing measure that he opposed, which caused the Assembly Speaker, Carl Heastie, to exclude funding. So they're saying, the Times is saying that Heastie, in a fit of pique, said to Mamdani, well, yes, you have a good program. Yes, it's working well. Yes, we're seeing more riders. Assaults are dropping. But you know what? You don't support this housing measure, so I'm taking the money out. That's what the Times is claiming. And they're blaming Mamdani. This was the most ridiculous thing. Somehow it's Mamdani's fault that the Speaker of the New York State Assembly pulls funding for a good program. It's somehow that's Mamdani's fault. But guess what? Heastie says that's not even true. That's not why he did it. That had nothing to do with it. There were other factors involved. That had nothing to do with a spat between Mamdani and me. Now, I still think they should have funded it. I don't know why they didn't. I'd like to know what was those other factors. But the fact is, both of them say, no. It wasn't anything about that landlord provision that Mamdani didn't, that Zohran Mamdani didn't like. By the way, I do put my money where my mouth is. I will be going up to New York this weekend for a couple of days to campaign for, to canvass for Zohran Mamdani. But let's just talk briefly a little more about that stuff. Okay, somehow, according to the Times, it's Mamdani's fault that Heastie pulled funding for a successful program, which the Times refuses to acknowledge was successful, even though it obviously was. But Heastie himself says, oh no, I have a good relationship with Zohran. He's honest and passionate. I get no surprises out of him. This is what he told the New York Times. I respect him. So I thought he was someone who couldn't get along with people. I thought he didn't compromise. But the Speaker of the House, who obviously disagrees with him on issues, didn't like the fact that he opposed a housing measure. Doesn't matter. It's like, I like him. We get along. We can work together. No, I didn't pull funding because of he didn't like some landlord provision or something or other. So, the Times is so incredibly dishonest here. And I had to really go into this. I really wanted to understand exactly what happened. The end of that was, and let me give you what the New York Times actually reported. Because the New York Times is attacking Mamdani because they claim his performative refusal to support a bill doomed his signature free bus pilot program. But according to the New York Times, he's a forceful voice in Albany. Yeah, he's a thin record. He's only been in Albany, relatively short time. By the way, what a terrible thing. We might have some young, vibrant, new voices in government. You think that might make some sense rather than the old guard that has done such a terrible job? Here's the bill that the Times reports Mamdani didn't like. Here's what Mamdani didn't like, according to the Times. This is not New York Magazine. He didn't like a landlord-friendly measure that was added late to the state budget. And he told Heastie he would vote against it. Wow. So this is a guy who's consistently championed tenants, who said, I want tenants to be protected. I don't want to give landlords too much ability to evict people, to raise rents. We have to maintain that balance that the New York Times feels is so important. And the balance is out of whack. Rents are way, way out of whack. There's too much hikes. It's impossible to live in the city. So I do oppose this landlord-friendly measure. And according to some people, Heastie was incensed and killed the pilot. Except that's not what Mamdani and Heastie say happened. So I'm trying to understand. This is the best the Times come. This was their best argument against Mamdani. He voted against a pro-landlord, anti-tenant provision that the Speaker of the House, it turns out, didn't even get upset about and didn't use to stop a bill that Mamdani did like. That's why the New York Times says you shouldn't vote for Mamdani. That's who the New York Times is. That's why I wonder, is it time to cancel this newspaper? Is it that bad? The problem is they provide value in other areas, not in terms of their opinion pieces, but in other areas. Now, I want to get to what they are saying. The New York Times, in the end, tells you to vote for other people besides Mamdani and Cuomo. They don't like Cuomo either. They're acknowledging. But they come out and they kind of say, well, but in the end, you kind of have to vote for one or the other. You have to vote for one or the other because if you don't, it's kind of like voting for Jill Stein. You're voting for somebody who can't win. So you got to vote for one or the other. And they make it absolutely clear you should not vote for Mamdani. So you have to vote for one of them. And that one isn't Mamdani. So obviously, what this paper is doing is endorsing in kind of a very backhanded, subterfugeous way Cuomo. It's disgraceful. It's just absolutely, it's horrific. Now, so you can't, I don't know what to do about this. We do not believe that Mamdani deserves a spot on New Yorkers' ballots. That's what they say. We do not believe he deserves a spot. Okay. And they do say later on, you have to, don't leave them both off. Don't leave them both. It's important to understand that this is tantamount to expressing no preference. You got to express a preference. And so they tell you, don't vote for Mamdani no matter what. Leave him off. And at the same time, you're voting for Jill Stein if you don't include one of them. So the thing that matters is the relative positions. So they're telling you, hey, vote for Cuomo. Just don't bother about all that corruption. Don't bother about the sexual harassment. Don't bother about the fact that the problems that we're describing in New York City occurred when Cuomo was governor. Unbelievable. What a piece of garbage. Just, it's so disgraceful. This is who the New York Times wants you to vote for. Andrew Cuomo. Cuomo has been unethical all along. And if you want to say, well, Cuomo, maybe he's unethical, but, things were good when he was governor. No, they weren't. No, they weren't. This was a time, again, of increasing wealth and income inequality, ever greater unaffordability crises throughout the state. No, things were not so good then. Not at all. And according, again, crew. So let's go through this. I think, it's one thing to just talk about, how he killed people and denied it and tried to cover it up. It's one thing to talk about the sexual harassment, but there's other factors too that really display the utter unfitness of Andrew Cuomo to be mayor of New York City. And they start with, and this is something I kind of remember, back when he was first governor, he created this Moreland Commission to root out corruption in the state. But, so that's a good thing, right? You want to root out corruption. New York is a notorious cesspool of conflicts of interest and bribery and graft. So he created it, and he promised that the commission would be free to work independently without interference. A promise he broke immediately upon its creation. Cuomo and his associates deeply, this is from the New York Times, which just endorsed Cuomo. Cuomo and his associates deeply compromised the panel's work, objecting whenever it focused on groups with ties to Cuomo, or even on issues that might reflect poorly on him. One of his aides, a top aide, Larry Schwartz, told commission leaders that Cuomo's off limits. I remember when that was reported. It was like amazing. You create an anti-corruption commission, and then you tell the commission you can't investigate me. That's Andrew Cuomo. And but that's who they want you to vote for mayor. It's because the other guy's too young, and the other guy voted against a pro-tenant provision in a bill, did not upset his speaker, despite doing so. That's who the New York Times wants you to vote against. That guy. Is there any justification? Seriously, is there any justification for continuing your subscription to the New York Times? Yes, there is, but the problem there, yes, there is, because there's no real other alternative. There's no alternative. Cuomo ended up disbanding the Anti-Corruption Commission prematurely, less than halfway through its tenure. And it produced one report on public corruption, which was written by an author handpicked by the governor over the other panel members' objections, which deliberately omitted mentions of unethical and corrupt actions linked to Cuomo himself. So after he disbanded it, the Attorney General, the U.S. Attorney for New York, did investigate the governor's interference with the panel, not the underlying corruption charges that were being investigated. He didn't say, okay, are you bribing people? Are you steering government contracts to your political allies? He didn't do that. He looked into simply whether the governor had the power to disband the commission, and he found he did. I mean, I assume he did. I don't know. I guess he had the power to do it, but it sure looks horrible. And there's plenty of corruption that has been brought home to Cuomo since then. And again, we're not talking about the 13 women who credibly charged him with sexual harassment. We're not talking about the nursing home deaths. This is just pure corruption under Cuomo. So one of his aides, Todd Howe, in 2016, pled guilty to federal corruption charges using access to the Cuomo administration to grant favors to clients. Another one, Joe Percoco, received more than $300,000 in bribes from executive. These are Cuomo, allies, people who were working, his aides, his executive deputy secretary. That's a high up office. $300,000 in bribes. Another associate who was managing $1.5 billion in Buffalo. He steered more than half of that amount, $850 million worth of state-funded contracts to Cuomo allies. Gee, that's just who we want in the mayor's office. That's just who we want in Gracie Mansion, is somebody whose aides steer city contracts all over the city. That's perfect. That's just the right choice. It is quite extraordinary. The New York Times editorial board is so bad, their opinions are so awful, that Tucker Carlson is better. I mean, he's better. I would prefer that Tucker Carlson, on balance, wrote their editorials, because I can only guesstimate that this editorial was written by, it was probably written by the editor-in-chief, but it was vetted by the big advertisers. It was vetted by AIPAC. I'm almost certain of that. There's no mention, by the way, of Cuomo's pandering to the Orthodox Jewish community, his support for the genocide. They don't mention that at all. Here's what Carlson says. The real divide isn't between people who support Israel and people who support Iran or the Palestinians. The real divide is those who casually encourage violence and those who seek to prevent it. And he's very, very pithy, right? So those like Trump or anyone else who supports the war on Iran, they're casually supporting violence. That's a good editorial. That's well written. That's so much better. That's who Tucker Carlson is. He's better than the New York Times editorial staff. And that doesn't mean much to say good about Carlson. It tells you just how bad the New York Times is. The New York media elites have completely failed this race. They've completely flunked it. They don't get it. Here's the New Yorker. There are no perfect choices. My son pointed this article out to me, and we were just laughing. He was laughing about the ridiculous false equivalency. So according to the New Yorker, there are no perfect choices in the New York City race. And why not? What are the differences between, why are they both imperfect? Well, one of them is just a few years removed from resigning amid an enormous sexual harassment and abuse of power scandal. That's pretty bad, right? That's somebody you probably don't want in office. You know, I'm not a big believer in all the woke stuff and the identity politics, and it can go too far when you seek out, you try to hold, you know, the Me Too movement went way too far, in my opinion, when they went after Al Franken. I wish he hadn't resigned. That was wrong what Kirsten Gillibrand did, and the party endorsed that. But that was wrong. This is very different. This is very, very different. What Al Franken supposedly did that was so terrible was basically when he was an entertainer. It wasn't even when he was senator in Minnesota. There was one woman who said he had inappropriately groped her at a state fair. That's not good. I'm not going to defend it. I think one example, I wouldn't say that means you have to leave office. Especially when, by all accounts, this is just a handsy guy. This is a guy who touches people. You know, people like that, they go, not just women either, right? You go up to a guy. I know people, they put their arm around me. They start rubbing me. You know, that's just how some people are. I'm not saying I like that. I personally am not like that. But some people are like that. Okay. I'm not going to drum a pretty decent senator out of office based on a claim that he was making crude jokes during a USO tour. My God, whoever does that? And then later on was a little handsy at the state fair. Okay, maybe he was. That's a lot different than 13 employees, 13 subordinates, 13 people doing business with the state of New York all say he put his arms around me. He pressured me to have sex. He sent me inappropriate texts. He sent me inappropriate pictures. That's who Andrew Cuomo is. And that's what the New Yorker is alluding to. And what's the problem with Mamdani? Well, he's only a decade removed from college. The guy's 33 years old. Maybe we want some youth. Do you think? Do you think that might be kind of a good thing? Wow. Obviously, Mamdani's your choice. It's not close. And the real question the New York Times raises, its editorial, it's caping for Cuomo. The real question it has to raise in your mind, should raise in your mind, is should you stop reading the newspaper? Should you cut it off completely? Should you flush it, as I note? And I'm not clear. Maybe you should. Yeah, I mean, it's really bad. I do urge you, whatever you do subscribe to Halitics. You can stop your subscription anytime to New York Times. I won't blink, but do regardless continue to subscribe to Halitics, or do subscribe to Halitics. And this is from Robert Reich, so I want to go after him too. Your elites invariably, consistently, over and over betray you. So here's what Reich says. Trump is not the cause of our divided nation. He is the symptom of a rigged system. Just came up 12 hours ago. That was already dividing us. It's not enough to defeat him. We must reform the system that got us here and ensure that no future politician ever imitates Trump's authoritarian demagoguery. All right, I agree with that. I mean, that's true. He's right there. But he's so impossible to take seriously because he supported Trump. I mean, he supported genociders, including Harris in 24. He supported Hillary, who was an awful choice in 2016, saying she would be a great president. So, no, Reich is not credible. If he wants us to buy his act, he's got to come clean and acknowledge what he got wrong. And that's what I told him. Now, it's interesting because, now he doesn't respond to what I have to say, but it's interesting because, there are people who see Reich's posts who also see mine. So, I responded to one of them who made the point, I thought a good point, kind of in response to Reich's late to the party comment, we need to reform the system so there aren't more Trumps in the future. They make the point that Democrats are a huge part of the problem too. And this person notes, hey, the Democrats rigged the primaries against Sanders twice anyway. So that's my view, of course. And I write, Reich is a phony. If he cared about reform, he would support Green Party candidates in general elections. Of course. You don't want new Trumps to emerge, then don't support them in either party. And then the response was, that would be especially true if that person wanted to guarantee that the Republicans never lost another election. So my response is, well, if you reflexively vote for Harris, Clinton, or whomever the Dem elites anoint, you're guaranteeing that the oligarchs and warmongers win every election, right? Obviously, because those are your choices. Both the Democrats and Republicans, oligarchs and warmongers. That's who you get if you vote Republican or Democrat. No response yet. Maybe that person will respond. I'm sure they'll, maybe she's not perfect, but you don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. That'll be the response. As though oligarchs and warmongers are good, they're just not perfect. No, they're bad. Reich is a phony. Tom Hartman is a phony. Here is an election that really matters. 2016 didn't matter. You got a bad choice either way. You got Hillary, you got Trump. They were both awful. You got TPP, or you got, just cruel. Not that Hillary's policy towards immigrants wasn't cruel. It was. But even worse from Trump. You got ardent Zionist on the Hillary side and on Trump's too. So either way, you got a bad outcome. They were both really bad. And Reich went to the mat for Hillary. He was on Hartman. Oh, be a great president. This was somebody who consistently killed his redistribution policies that he supported, his pro-labor policies that he supported when he was in the Clinton White House. Hillary was consistently his adversary. But yet he's telling everyone, she'd be a great president. Based on available information, Reich has not endorsed anyone. So here's a race where there's actually a good candidate that you could endorse. That would be Zoran Mamdani. But he doesn't endorse. No, I don't want to get involved in the primary. I mean, any Democrat's okay with me. Public statements and writings, including his Substack, do not mention any endorsements in the New York City mayoral election. Really very upsetting. Now, you might say, well, he's in Berkeley. What does he know from New York? Robert Reich is sending out a gazillion emails every day to millions of people. He pays extra, obviously, to have that ability. He has real influence. If he came out with editorials, opinion pieces strongly supporting Mamdani, it would be important. It would make a difference. It would be pertinent. Would it change the trajectory of the race? I don't know. But it might. What about Hartman, everybody's favorite professor? Wouldn't you think he might endorse Mamdani? Maybe. There is no evidence suggesting that Hartman. This is a guy who gets hundreds of thousands of people watching his live stream, his videos. No evidence suggesting that Hartman is endorsed in this race. Why not? Why haven't you? When push comes to shove, these people are nowhere to be found. They're not going to take on the Democratic elites. They're not going to take on the Democratic establishment. Sure, they'll criticize and carp about certain things that they do. But when it comes to it, when it comes to what really matters, who wins elections, who ultimately gets power, They sit it out. They only support Democrats ultimately in general election. Now, they did support Bernie. I'll give him that. I think Hartman supported Bernie. Reich did too. But, you know, he came around. He came around. That's going to do it for me. 120. Looking forward to Peter B tomorrow, and we'll talk. I do have the editorial that is so upsetting about anti-Semitism as well. I will talk about Peter B. He's not Jewish. I hope he's not uncomfortable discussing it, but you know, my view is it's outrageous the way the Times framed that somehow the real problem we face is somehow anti-Semitism, when it most certainly is not. It really just isn't. It's just not the problem. Again, the question, is it time to flush? I'm going to ask Peter B. That's what we're going to be discussing tomorrow. And I'd like your thoughts. I really would. Is it time to give up the New York Times? Put your response in the comments or in the chat.